Mariam. It's a pleasure to be interviewing you today. For those who don't know, Mariam Barghouti, she's a Palestinian journalist, activist, researcher, writer, and is currently based in Ramallah, which is a Palestinian city in the West Bank. Her work is often featured on Al Jazeera, The Guardian, Huffington Post, New York Times, and many other news platforms. As an aspiring journalist like myself, I dream to be a person like Mariam, so it's an honor to be interviewing you. And I commend you for all that you do in support for our cause. So I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, and if you can answer them, enlighten us with your knowledge and share with us what it's like to be a Palestinian currently living in Palestine as a journalist and as an activist. So I want to hear about what is happening in Palestine currently and how Palestinian voices are continuously being silenced and censored. So my first question to you, Mariam, is, as a person who's based in Palestine as of now, can you share us firsthand what the past couple of weeks have been like in my country?
Thank you, Noor. It's first of all, I'm very humbled and grateful to have the space and platform, which is kind of like the segue to being exposed to chronic silencing and censorship. And I feel when we say that, many people don't understand what that means, right? So censorship isn't just the removal of our posts on social media. My own account was closed down by Twitter for quote unquote violating their policy, which they reinstated hours after realizing it was wrong. But in the moment, I was in the middle of a demonstration, we were being shot at. The timing is really what's so detrimental about the silencing, the blackout that's on us. And the way, for example, media represents us, that's silencing us as well, rioting, throwing rocks, completely decontextualized, no reference whatsoever that no matter what Palestinians use, even if it's the Hamas rockets, it is not comparable, nor is it proportionate to a military power that Israel has, a nuclear military power. It is currently one of the strongest armies in the world, has the most technologically advanced weapons, which it is selling and exporting to other places in the world. Canada included, the US included, to serve white supremacy. And then you have in other regions in the Arab world, like Egypt or the Gulf, which are essentially authoritarian. So it's really not even the practice, of exchanging their technology, but the intention of it and who it's serving. And this is the message that's being silenced by Palestinians. It is not a single tweet. It is not a single image. It is not one breath. It is the complete erasure of our existence. Until now, you have Palestinians that are from what's deemed Israel proper, called as Israeli Arabs. Where's their identity? And why do they not have a choice in selecting, framing, and defining their identity? And this is what ethnic cleansing is. Ethnic cleansing does not have to happen in the image of the wars of antiquity. It doesn't have to resemble World War I or II or any genocides that took place around the world. What is happening here is spatiocide, and it is demographic engineering of a population through replacing and driving them out. It is the complete erasure of the history of a place and redefining it. And it is the continued escalation to erase an existence of an entire people and a history and a potential future. So that's what's happening in Palestine, as has been happening for the past 70 plus years. In the past couple of weeks, and everyone here with me today, I want you to keep taking breaths as I speak, because necessarily a lot of your own truths may be challenged, and that's okay. So I don't just want to challenge, I want to hold space for that. So please take breaths. The Israeli settler community, and I conclude, and Palestinians include, places like Tel Aviv as a settler colony. So it's not just the West Bank and Gaza, nor is it Jerusalem. It is historic Palestine from the river to the sea. And if that makes anyone uncomfortable, do sit with yourself and ask why. because there is racism in that, an ideological racism. And it's our job to unpack that. But there has been an escalation. Palestinians with Israeli citizenship have been targeted strategically for participating in protests last year. They're being fined very heavy fines and bail money, and that is socioeconomic blackmail that Israel is enforcing. In Jerusalem, you still have families in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah fighting the Israeli court system that is completely legalizing what is happening by using fancy words. And this is where words matter. This is why Palestinians say it is not a conflict, it is colonialism. And we understand that we've delegated that term to activists or scholars. But what is happening is colonialism. And this is a title of a practice. And we need to start calling it as such. In the West Bank, settlers are coming out to the streets daily, throwing stones at Palestinian cars and families. And suddenly throwing stones is not so scary and risky. The Israeli military says, oh, it's just stones. But when a Palestinian does it, we can get sentenced up to 10 years in military prison. And I was arrested in 2014 in Nabi Saleh, a village here that's known for its weekly protests. And the soldier was going to sentence me for throwing stones. Complete false allegations, but how quickly it is that these things can be weaponized against us. And again, it's one direction. And the emboldenment of the settler community in tandem with American politics, primarily Trump administration, but all of them, really, all the administrations allowing this impunity has been manifesting in ways that is very difficult to capture in words. Because it's not about the firing of bombs on Gaza. It's not about the drones that are increasingly in our sky space. It's about the experience. It's about me, my inability to sleep properly, the fact that no matter where I go in the world, that this place will haunt you. And I'm sure Noor, especially last year, how it must have been nerve-wracking to just wait for updates from family members on them being okay. And if you survive the bullet, you don't survive the trauma afterwards. So now we're at a point where Palestinians are engaging more and more with armed resistance. So you see an increase in the usage of militant activities within the Palestinian community, from throwing stones to shooting to stabbing attacks. And yeah, that's scary. But what's scarier is having a tank and a military jeep in your village with complete impunity. So what the point that we've reached, and I think no one's really discussing this, and it's important to, Palestinians are legitimizing armed resistance and violent resistance at this point, because when you're getting beaten constantly, when you have a foot on your neck constantly, the moment you muster any inkling of energy, you're not going to let it go to waste, right? And this is not out of despair. It's the youth saying, you know what? We're about to reach our 30s and our 40s, and we'd really like it to be free. We've already wasted our childhood, 8, 10, 9, 11, our youth, 13, 14, 20s, on this, living this. Is it not normal? Is it not okay to say, actually, we don't want it anymore? And if the world, at the bare minimum, is refusing to even boycott and criminalizing that practice. And I know people like Noor are at risk of being demonized and criminalized in places like Canada and the UK and the US. We're saying, you know what, then fine, we're gonna go all out because we deserve that. And that's what's happening. And it's frightening. It's terrifying, because we also recognize this is where the international community needs to step up. Palestinians are basically cleaning up the mess of the UK. Nobody told Lord Balfour to sign that document. Nobody told the US to legitimize Israel. Nobody told Canada to declare it with the UN as a state. And right now we're bearing the brunt of it, and yet we're being criminalized for it. So it's reaching a point, and we've warned, we've said that it will reach this point, because human life is meant to be lived. And that doesn't mean breathing, that means to live. And contribute and think and innovate without being scared that I just said river to the sea on a recorded talk, And I know that's a crime that I can be charged with, right? So it's reaching a point of, last year we were at our final breath. Right now we're, I think, at a final act. So we know that Palestine will either be testament to the failure of the world and a lesson for years to come, or it will be a testament to we have changed, that we have triumphed over these systems and relationships of injustice. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or
You
it's
kind of
clear.
covered a lot of what I wanted also to ask you. I know, for instance, when I lived in Palestine, I always wanted to be a journalist and an activist, even at such a young age. But my parents were always like, you're not going to be able to do that freely in Palestine. How do you get, I mean, obviously, as a Palestinian, I do get the courage and resilience to stand up in solidarity with my country. But I also know that in Canada, I have more freedom to express that, even though not entirely, but I still have more freedom to express that than in Palestine. So how do you get the courage and resilience to be able to practice that, knowing that at any chance you might get arrested, you might be called out, you might, I don't want to say it, but like you might get killed. You never know what Israel is up to.
Right. I'm really glad you asked that. And this is where I also move away from Israel, right? I don't have the courage. I don't think any of us really have the courage. It's the necessity of it, right? When, just I feel like this reminds me of the times when my mother, who's a complete, like, my mom gets scared from her own shadow, right? But when it's in a moment where her kids are in danger, the courage that we see, we're like, oh, it's like very instinctive, in that if you see this kind of threat, you're not thinking about your limitations. You're just you're doing a quick inventory check of what you can do and you go with it, right? I actually left journalism for years. And I started journalism because I was disenchanted and frustrated with the journalists that were coming here, international journalists most of the time, especially for mainstream media. Think CNN, think New York Times. All of them almost always have correspondents that are Israelis, but a Palestinian correspondent, no, that's not objective. We're likely to be biased, right? Which shows you how the double standard is very disgusting and a threat. I genuinely see it as a threat to journalistic integrity, which is where I moved to writing political analysis and research. So yeah, research. And it was more also about safeguarding myself, right? I do empirical data analysis, which somehow people think is more scientific than our own testimony. But that's kind of how I've been able to continue my work. If the world wants to think like this, then okay, I will try to meet the world at its language. So it's not about courage, again, as it is about necessity. The fears are real. Palestinian journalists are not protected. The amount of attacks that we have seen in the past year have been escalating, targeting journalists very specifically, especially local journalists. And they're integral they're messengers, and they're integral in mobilization and informing people. And that's why Israeli disinformation is so dangerous and has convinced a good chunk of the world that being anti-apartheid is equivalent to being anti-Semitic, rather than actually tackling global anti-Semitism, which is increasing. And that's not something that should be denied, but strategically addressed. And then you come to the Palestinians. Let's not also kid ourselves or lie. Last year in Nizar Banat, a Palestinian who was running for local elections and a critic of the Palestinian Authority, which is de facto the governing body in the West Bank, as Hamas is in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority assassinated Nizar in his home with clubs in front of his children, dragging him out. And this was on June 24th last year. And it was over what? A video he made exposing how the Palestinian Authority purchased expired vaccines from Israel, which was willing to sell us expired vaccines. Look at, this is also demographic engineering and the worthlessness and the supremacy that is embedded within Israeli society. So yeah, the threats are real, which is why censorship, your original question, comes in. What protects us is keeping the eyes on Palestine. No abuser has ever committed their crime in the open unless the people support you. So like, you know, Palestinians are not going to get attacked if the entire world is looking, right? Because if you look long enough, something in you is going to move. Something in you is going to do something. We're not static beings. We're in constant motion. And that's why Israel wants to censor. So what also keeps us protected is it's not the knowledge that we're going to survive this. Most of us have been living this past couple of years knowing very well we might die today. It is knowing that someone will see and someone will not let this be a passive absorption of information, but an active addition to what we can do next. And this is where people, you know, like all of you come in, where you're protected more. You, not just, you know, or Mariana or anyone that's speaking against Israel is also protected in their communities. And that's community. That's what keeps us protected.
As a graduate of university recently, I was the president of the Palestinian Cultural Club, and we were very censored when it came to promoting political activities on campus grounds. So I was wondering what kind of advice, because I know somebody in the audience here as well is going through that in their own universities, and I know in my work, I struggle, like a lot of students struggle a lot with being censored by Israeli students on campus and being restricted from being political, and they're called out to the campus authorities. So I was wondering, what advice do you have for Canadian supporters or Palestinian people that are standing in solidarity for this cause? What do you recommend they do in this case?
That's a really good question. I'm not, again, you know, I like to humble myself. I never really have a full picture or insight on the dynamics that you must navigate. I'm sure your own context is very different than mine, but again, it's community. It's also proactiveness, right? If you're on a campus and you want to be vocal, you come together, go to the authorities before anything and tell them, hi, are you, one, Islamophobic? Because being anti-Palestinian is very much embedded in that. And ask them, or are you pro-apartheid? And have them decide for themselves that stand. And if they are pro-apartheid, then I'm sorry, but disengage, completely disengage. This whole, you know, you have like the American notion, we don't engage or we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? But constantly Palestinians are told, sit in a room with a person that is chronically abusing you and maybe you'll be happy together, right? So I would say go straight to the authorities, give them the reality check, get them uncomfortable. This is not okay. The only reason most genocides in the world happened was not because, for example, the soldiers fully believed it, right? But because no one challenged it, no one confronted that it can be otherwise. It's so difficult for us to go to what's not familiar. And I really resemble the relationship Palestinians have with Israel and the international community as a toxic relationship. You know, try and think like domestic abuse. And most people facing domestic abuse don't leave because it's just so difficult to fathom an unfamiliar reality, even though it could be so much better. So yeah, challenge people, get them uncomfortable, and stand your ground. Arm yourself with all the knowledge. I have, for example, one thing we have done together here is that this constant abuse of the Holocaust narrative. I remember for years, for decades, Palestinians were unable to even draw parallels, right, between our reality and the horrors of the Holocaust. We went and read every autobiography of every survivor. We read every narrative written about that era and came back deep conviction and conclusion that the entire history is being weaponized. That we know that the Holocaust, for example, is the history of 30% of the Israeli Jewish community. The rest are Mizrah. This does not apply to them. So it's how they've manipulated the narrative and pointed out. But my answer is to disengage, stand your ground. There's going to be a lot of loss and a lot of sacrifice, but stand your ground. And if you see someone silencing another person for standing up for justice, call it out. You don't have to attack, but call it out. Say, hey, that's not okay. I recommend that you read, for example, Ilan Pape's book or Raja Shhadeh. And it's always, for me, relating it to the big, right? So also move away from Palestinian exceptionalism when you're organizing on Palestine, because our cause is not our cause. Our cause is a symbol of very much bigger structures of power and domination. So ask them, would you ever deny a woman who was raped her testimony? Would you? Because we have, at that, at that metaphor, the amount of women and men and boys that were sexually assaulted and raped and harassed by Israeli settlers and soldiers. So what about that crime if you don't want to deal with colonialism? So it's like that fluctuation in understanding Palestine as a microcosm of something bigger, I think also eases people in. I don't think people genuinely want to or support Israel because they believe well, some do, yeah, but generally the public. So it's okay for us to shake things up, be proactive and hold space, but also when you want to disengage. It's not your job to educate anyone either. If they don't want to listen. Is the point to debate, to prove each other right? No, the point is to stop us from dying. The point is to open the siege on Gaza, 16 years now. So it's protect your energy as well.
I know
Sorry
a lot
if I'm talking a lot.
say, especially the youth, say that Palestine, like it's seen as just a trend. Like whenever something happens, a lot of people start talking about it, but then it dies down. Nothing starts happening, and then it shifts back to being normal, and people forget about the cause or like stop talking about it, especially on social media. So what do you recommend? Like, how do we keep talking about it and bringing it up with it staying relevant? Because a lot of people are just like jumping from one thing to the other, and they're always forgetting about the cause. But then when Gaza gets bombed or when the Aqsa gets attacked, people start talking about it, but then again it dies down. Like I remember last year there was a huge protest all over the world, but then things settled down a bit, and then during the year nobody really spoke much about what's going on in Palestine. They kind of forgot about the cause. So what do you say?
That's actually a really good question. So there's this thing in journalism, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, Noor. If it bleeds, it leads, right? So that's when like something big is happening, bombing, or people are dying in mass scale, we move because we're like, oh, whoa, the destruction is reaching a big level. It's kind of like COVID, right? You had epidemics in different parts of the world, primarily, in the African region. No one really cared. But when it impacts the world, it's that large scale, we all kind of went in. So anything that's big scale, we're going to talk about it. Yeah. When it dies down, and this is where the Israeli lobbying machine begins its work, not during, moments of eruption. It doesn't when no one's looking, when we're quiet. And this is also where we're mistaken. So there's a thing in journalism where you only report something that's happening in real time, right? And that's kind of how we began responding to the world around us. It's okay to take a break. We also need to learn we can't be talking about Palestine 24/7, all of us at the same time. But we can tag team. So, we're only human, very limited as individuals, and as a community, much stronger. Take your moments of silence. You're going to get tired. We all get tired. You're going to get burnout. For the international community, Palestine might not be so personal or intimate for you. So you can afford it a very selective amount of energy. We understand that. You have your own lives and your own struggles. But it's about strategic building, right? So it's not about doing everything all the time. It's about what you're doing very strategically. I'm going to work to boycott Israeli goods. So you start doing that in your household. Then you bring in your neighbors. What this contributes to is a ripple effect, a domino effect. So we might not see the impact this year or next year, but in 5 years' time, when there is an eruption, and as long as the violence persists from settlers, we're going to keep erupting, we will have a better chance actually mobilizing in a way that is effective and impactful, or at least proportion like wise, we can equalize power dynamics to afford Palestinians a chance, right? So yeah, take a rest if you need to. It's okay to not talk about Palestine 24/7, but situate your practices of solidarity in their long-term impact, not in how they will make you feel good in a moment.
I really like this answer. I feel like it's very refreshing. And I always put pressure on myself personally, like to always be talking about it, always kind of promoting the culture, whether it's like through the trees or dakar or the food. But then I know it's like the more you promote it, but not like actually practicing, it's still good. Like it's still good enough. So I need to keep that in mind. Just because I feel so far away from home, I feel the need to always compensate for me being far. But yeah, I should take that advice. Okay, so I have one last question and then we'll open the space for Q&A. But I wanted to ask you, what would be your advice for individuals that are outside of Palestine that end up on Canary Mission or like that are blacklisted in Israeli sites? Like how can they continue their solidarity work while also getting a job or entering Palestine? I know this is like a sensitive topic, but it needs to be talked about because a lot of people that I literally search up like a professor's name or anybody that's pro-Palestine, and I always see the first thing that pops up, oh, Canary Mission, and that scares me, especially as a upcoming journalist and activist as well.
I think that's an excellent question. And this is one of the intimidation tactics that Israel uses, right? Like, okay, well, if we can't get you to stop talking, we're going to make sure every part of your life is impacted. Again, this is also economic blackmail, right? And denial of social status, for example. One, so this is a personal account, right, of what can be done. But things that have worked with me and friends is one, we make it irrelevant. So those of us that were on Canary Mission started from the get-go saying, hey, we're on Canary Mission. You know, that's a testament not of what the website is saying or Israel is saying. That's a testament that I stood against the crowd. That is a testament that I'm anti-apartheid. And send that, like clarify it in your cover letters, clarify it in your CVs. And if an employee has a problem with that, or an employer, honestly, you don't want to work with them. Tell them, you know, instead of it being used against you, start using it against them. Telling them, well, you're an apartheid stance. Honestly, we're really in 2022, lived through a pandemic, and we really don't have time for this. So it's doing that. And I understand that that's maybe doesn't seem practical, but again, let's think long term and how this can help. The other thing is work at your state level, or like, you know, town council levels, in creating policies that protect people that are anti-apartheid. Be very specific. It's not that, but your anti-apartheid stance, your anti-occupation stance, and keep it broad, because there are going to be many struggles that are going to come in the future, and this can serve that as well. So that could help. And in your intimate circles, create committees where you have a fund for people that become unemployed when they speak out, for example, on Palestine. A committee that looks at jobs and applies, a committee that's going to give a call to that dean that fired the professor, just very blatantly asking, we don't understand, you know, please explain to us how you're justifying this. Or genuinely ask, maybe they don't know. Also afford people their ignorance, and extend your energy as much as you can without burning yourself out, but to extend your energy to give a learning moment and an unlearning moment, as hard as that is. But yeah, also just wear it with pride. Honestly, change the dynamics.
I love that. That's a very articulate answer, and I feel like it gives me hope and it gives me courage to continue doing what I do without the fear, and doing it while being proud of my identity and what I stand for. Because at the end of the day, this is our mission. Like this, our mission is finding justice for Palestine. It was amazing interviewing you, and now I'm gonna open the I'm going to open the space for Q&A. So whoever wants to come ask Mariam Barghouti a question or is interested in learning more about a specific topic that I didn't bring up during my questions for her, please feel free to come up and ask. Okay. Hello.
Hi. Thank you for your questions. They've been wonderful. Hi, I'm Barbara, and thank you so much for your answers and for your courage and your expertise in working in journalism in the context that you're in. I'm just wondering how you, if there are ways that you can connect with other anti-apartheid, anti-occupation journalists, and where do you find your strength to keep going on? Because I mean, all of us face that at times where we don't have the energy to keep going, even though mentally we might be, you know, still opposing. We don't have the energy or the hope sometimes. So where do you find that? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Barbara. And thank you for joining, all of you, and listening. I don't know about you, but I do want to make a quick disclaimer. But even talks I go to, I know it's inevitable that sometimes we'll zone out or miss things or get bored or anything. So bless you all for sharing these breaths with me. And thank you, Barbara. In regards of where do I find it? So many journalists and researchers come here with, you know, malleable perceptions of the Palestinian reality, and also their own assumptions that they've gained through mainstream media that are very problematic. And it's not anti-apartheid journalists or anti-occupation really, but I found the writers, the journalists, the analysts that will uphold journalistic integrity at all costs, right? Whether that means being anti-occupation, anti-apartheid, or anti-dictator, because we also saw a lot of what's happening in the Arab world and how like that created rift with people. And more than like finding the hope, it's seeing just people come together in places I least expected. Last year, you know, when there were statements by professors that I never imagined, you know, writing these words, and journalists being fired from places like the Washington Post, editors formerly at the New York Times coming out and speaking about how they were censored. And the way we draw hope from that is it validates a lot of what we've been saying, because we've been saying this happened. But you know how sometimes your testimony is turned against you, or you're called crazy, or this isn't true. And suddenly, like last year, we saw everyone sharing the factual experiences or the datas and the numbers and the statements of what we have been saying is happening based on our experience, right? On our reality. So that validation gives us hope that 70x or 70 so years later, after my grandfather, people are saying apartheid. 20 years ago, the word occupation wasn't allowed on Palestine. Suddenly it's gaining steam, and that is people coming to talks like this. That is journalists taking that firing, and it is overcoming fear. If we are doing anything out of fear, it's not going to be good, and it's not going to be focused. So it's when I see people, they're like, okay, actually, no. And they're overcoming the risk of losing friends and losing family. And, you know, there are people that come from Zionist households and they're standing against their family. That is a lot. And it is a lot of alienation, isolation, and yet they still did it. So that's usually how we here draw hope. You know, they still did it. And then, of course, there's history. If history taught us one thing, it is that justice inevitably returns in one way or another. So we try to not lose sight of that as well. I hope that answers.
She says thank you. Anybody else wants to answer? Yeah, okay.
Hi, thank you very much for what you've shared with us. It's been So much appreciated. In Ramallah, Canada has a mission, and it's staffed by a Canadian. It's a subset of the embassy in Tel Aviv. I'm wondering if there's any assistance, help, hope that comes from that. And if not, what should we Canadians be doing to put pressure on the mission in Ramallah to wake up and do more?
Thank you so much for that. That's such an excellent question. So I've met with the mission here a few times. And I mean, I will say one thing, Canada or even like the US delegation, for example, or EU are so disempowered. Every single time we like propose sanctioning Israeli settlement goods in Canada, it's like, oh, but we can't do that because of our relationship to Israel. And again, my question is always, why do you still want to maintain this relationship? It's really time, you know, like let's just file for divorce. Why don't we all just do collective divorce Israel? So they're very disempowered. And another thing that I've learned is that these missions cannot do anything unless their citizens demand it. In the end, they represent not Palestinians. Canada represents Canada in Palestine, right? So demanding the revoking all Canadian citizenship from all the settlers living in the West Bank. Why do they get to have this dual citizenship? Now, this is a policy that you can actually call for, but we need Canadian citizens to call for it, right? So the mission here is a mere reflection of Canada. And on your lands, and demand that, you know, dual citizenship should not be allowed for settlers under any context. And it'll dissuade future conquering attempts. And more than this, the mission here, I feel like it still does not reconcile Canada's own colonial past. Now, to deal with our colonial present, we also need to acknowledge that. So working in Canada on Indigenous rights there, on the right to their land, is also going to ripple effect to foreign policy on Palestine.
Amazing answer. It really sheds light a lot. Like it really enlightened me. I wanted to thank you so much, Mariam, and I want to thank you on behalf of the audience here. I'm sure they learned a lot, and you are an amazing guest, and it was an honor to have you and to interview you. And hopefully we do meet someday. And thank you so much again for all that you do for Palestine and for attending this event and for sharing your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it.